Okay, boys and girls, here we go with our history review for the first part of the first trimester, which is about Introduction to Historical Thinking. So this is the part of the trimester and the part of the year in which we think about history itself. What does it mean to make any historical studies at all? And we're going to oversee all the concepts, the main concepts that we're going to be using throughout the year in order to study history. So, let's begin with that. So these are the 5 topics that are going to be coming in your exam. The definitions of history, the scales of history, durations of history, the century as unit of analysis of history, and finally the sources for history. So let's start with the definitions. Okay, in here you have the 4 definitions that we are going to have in our exam. If you remember, the first 2 definitions, the one that are above the red line, are 19th century definition. These definitions come from the 19th century. So the 19th century is the 1800s. Yes, so it is very important that you are able to tell apart what these definitions are, as opposed to these other definitions, how they are different to these definitions. Because mainly in science and mainly in history, a lot of people still think as they used to do in the 19th century. And it is going to depend even on the author, but there were many authors in the 19th century that actually used to think in a more developed way than many people do today. That is the case of Mr. Edward Brunet Taylor. He was quite more intelligent than a lot of people now. But that is not the point here. The point here is that we need to change our way of thinking about history and about science itself. So these are the first 2 definitions that we have here. The one coming from Leopold von Ranke, which was German. He's the guy saying history is to tell things as they actually were. So remember, the main problem here is that history is not able to tell things as they actually were. We have no access to that knowledge. What we can do, and the reason because of which history is science, is because we produce hypotheses. We develop knowledge on the basis of hypotheses, on the basis of evidence that are our sources, and also using some theories in order to make interpretations about that evidence, and that is social theory in general. Our knowledge of how do societies work. So that is the main problem with the definition coming from Leopold Ranke. Nowadays, a lot of people try to tell you that there is a real history, and we cannot know what is the real history in general. Like, we shouldn't say real history anymore. All history is built on the basis of hypotheses and with evidences that are our sources, and using also social theory in order to make interpretations with those evidences, with those sources. So our second definition here, the definition coming from Signoveau and Langlois, which were the teachers of Marc Bloch, by the way. They were Marc Bloch's teachers. It says, history is the methodological study, so we follow a procedure in order to study documents that allow us to treat them in such a way that we can order historical events and say something about the past. So if you remember, we mainly have 2 problems with this definition, and it is this part over here, which is saying that history can only be made with documents, and the other one is that it is restricting history to the past. So remember, we have a bunch of sources that are different to documents. We can use documents as sources, and we like them very much as sources, but we can actually use a lot of different materials as our sources. So not only the study of documents can produce history. And also remember that history does not only study the past, but also the present, and perhaps it may propose some things about the future. So these are the main issues with this definition. Then we are going to come to the third definition, that is the definition that we are going to be using throughout this year, the definition from Marc Bloch. This is our definition, but you also need to be able to tell why it is the definition that we're going to use. Why is this the good definition and not the other ones? And that is because it has mainly three very important points on its favor. First, of course, it has very clear that it is a science, that is important, but mainly because it says that what we study are the doing of men, the doings of men, everything that man does, and men in plural, not man, men, because we're mainly talking about societies, human societies, right? That is what history studies, human societies. I know that you cannot read that really well. Let's try again. Society. That is what history studies, societies. And also, another thing that this definition has really clear and that is really correct, I'm sorry about that, and that is really correct about this definition is the fact, okay, I can finish writing now, give me a second. Society or societies in plural, right? So that is the main focus of history, the doing of men in plural, talking about societies. And the other thing that is really important here is that it is talking about time in general, not only the past, not only the present even, time in general. So that is, as we were saying, perhaps the past, perhaps the present. Historians do study the present. It is something really important that historians do. We study the present, and perhaps we even propose some things about the future. Finally, we have this definition coming from Lucien Favre. Lucien Favre was also a student of Signeuvaux and Langlois. He was a partner of Marc Bloch. He started a magazine with Marc Bloch, the magazine that made Marc Bloch really famous. He was a co-director with Marc Bloch, but his definition has a couple of issues. If you remember, we're not using Lucien Favre's definition because of two reasons. The first reason, of course, is that he is basically saying that history is only about the past. Yes, and he's also saying that we cannot, that history is not about things or concepts. And it is somehow true. It is about men, that is absolutely true. But we may use things as sources, that is important, things are sources, but mainly concepts. Concepts are perhaps the biggest mistake that Lucien Favre had here, because it actually exists one type of history called the history of concepts. It is very possible to make history about concepts. Why? Because concepts really, concepts actually speak about the mind of people. They speak about how people are thinking in a certain period of time. So it is actually quite accurate, and it is very, very possible to write history about concepts. I'm going to write it again because it is really ugly. History of concepts. That is a P of concepts. Yes. And this history of concepts was originally proposed by a guy called, I always forget his name, give me a second. The one that proposed the history of is Koselleck, Reinhard Koselleck. He's a historian that proposed originally this idea of history of concepts. Yeah, Reinhard Koselleck with a K. So it is actually possible to write history of concepts, and not because we are only taking concepts into consideration, but because concepts allow us to show how humanity or societies are thinking in a certain period of time. This is a brain, by the way. If you use your imagination, over here I drew a brain. So that is how societies are thinking. So yes, those are the main issues of the definition of Lucien Favre. That it is not only about the past, and also that it is actually really possible to do history about concepts, and it is quite a good way of making history. Then we have the scales of history. Remember that scale is all about the size, and in this case it is about the size of the scale of observation, how broad or how small are you going in order to make your observations about history. So of course the smallest thing would be the biography, because it is going as small as only one person. So biography is just about presenting the history of one person, the life of one person. And that other word is also very important. It is only about presenting. There is no explanation here. Monograph also, it is about presenting a topic in an extensive way. You really want to say everything there is about one topic, but again, you are just presenting. There is no explanation here. A monograph is not explaining, it's presenting the history of one particular topic, or one particular topic of history, but you have no explanation either. Then you have local history, which again, local or regional, it would be more or less the same. In local or regional history, you're just presenting the history of a certain place or a region, right? Or a group of places that have something in common. But again, you're just presenting this history. You are not explaining anything at all with it. Explanations do only start here with global history. And that is why this is the approach that we are going to be taking for our history course. It is not only global history, but it can also be known as total history or also as problem history. And these three names mean more or less the same. They are trying to tell you the same thing. Global history means that you want to give a global explanation about a certain social phenomenon. Total history refers to exactly the same thing. You want to give a total explanation of a social phenomenon. And problem history, again, it is about trying to solve a research problem about a certain social phenomenon. So the point here is that the explanation of this problem is going to be a global or total explanation. That means you are going to really give all the points that you need to give in order to explain the whys and the whos and the whens and the whats and the processes and everything that comprises this problem. So I always give you the example of this book by Mark Bloch, The Royal Touch, in which in which people used to believe that the kings could heal of certain diseases just by touching people, and these were the kings both of France and England. So in this case, what Mark Bloch is doing is giving a total explanation of this problem of history. Remember, when I tell you a problem of history, I am not trying to tell you solve economic crisis or solve pollution, solve global warming. That is not at all what I am saying. When I am speaking about a problem, I am speaking about a research problem, so something that you want to explain. Solving a research problem means you want to explain something, not you want to give a solution to that particular problem. When in history you are studying economic crisis, you are trying to explain the reasons of those economic crises in their particular historical horizon, but you are not trying to give a solution of economic implications. You are trying to solve a question of history. Also, when you are trying to explain global warming in a historical point of view, what you're going to do is explain all the processes and all the reasons and all the different implications that produced in history global warming, like for example the Industrial Revolution that started to cause a lot of pollution and that industrialized the world, thus bringing a lot of pollution with it and a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. That would be to solve the problem of global warming according to history, not actually giving a solution as we need more green cars, we need solar energy. That is not giving a solution to a problem in terms of history. In terms of history, giving a solution to a problem means to give an answer on all the historical processes that were implicated into this particular condition in history. It is not about trying to solve economics, it is not about trying to solve politics, it is about trying to be able to explain all the reasons and all the consequences of this phenomenon. So in this case, it is about explaining why and how were people actually believing that that the kings could heal just by touching. Then we have world history. In world history, what we are going to be seeing is the presentation. In this level, we lose the explanation again. We go back to just presenting something. And in this case, it is presenting several places of the world, the history of several places of the world. But here you have a big clue. Right here in the title of your book, Great Civilizations, you have a very big clue on why it is not the history of the whole world, but just the history of several places of the world. Because there are only, first of all, as I always tell you, world history is the history of several places of the world as seen by the West. What is the West? Well, basically, the culture that came from Europe. So this culture that started in Europe and that spread to many places of the world, this is the culture that is going to be observing these places. And thus, this culture is not going to be interested in explaining societies such as tribes, such as tribal confederacies, such as chiefdoms. They are going to be interested in this very funny thing that they call civilizations. And of course, we shouldn't use this word anymore, because civilization means they're trying to use civilization as an opposition to barbarism and to savagery. Barbarics and or barbarians and savages. So we shouldn't use this word anymore, because what you are saying when you say civilized societies or civilizations, what you are saying is that there are other societies that are barbarians and there are other societies that are savages. So we shouldn't say that anymore, because all societies have a lot of things to teach us. So there is no point on saying this anymore. We shouldn't. We are not going to use it. But world history is always going to be doing this. It is going to be taking the culture that we got from Europe, and it is going to be using it to observe several societies that in particular have some ways of organization and certain ways of living, certain let's say pattern of settlement, ways in which they are going to be organizing houses and buildings and everything. We're going to see that just starting the second half of this trimester, but for now, just take this very good, have this very present in your minds, right? World history will always be giving this point of view of civilizations, and it is going to be choosing always the societies that they're going to be talking about based on very racist criteria. So yes, in this case, it is about power in history. And finally, big history, that, as I always tell you, it is a terrible way of thinking about history. This is just some propaganda developed by Bill Gates in order to sell something, right? As if he didn't have enough money, but they are still trying to sell you this really, really bad idea, this really wrong idea about what is history, and they are selling it in such a marvelous way, right? This deletes the boundaries between space and time and geography and geology and history and chan, but it is really terrible. It is a really, really bad way of doing history, because what they are saying is that, well, in order to explain social phenomena, they are going to go as back as the Big Bang, but that is absolutely ludicrous. That is ridiculous, because I really don't need to explain the Big Bang in order to explain Napoleon and the French Revolution or Mexico's independence. Like, I really don't need to go as far as that. And that also implies a very important methodological problem, because if I need to go as far back as the Big Bang in order to give any explanation at all, well, then I am not going to be able to explain anything, because imagine the millions and millions of years that I would have to explain in order to get to, well, even the first human societies at all. So this really is, this proposal really has precisely the notion of a scale of observation, well, really bad understood. They don't really understand what is a scale of observation, and they are proposing just this really terrible way of doing history just in order to sell you the idea of learning a lot lot, but it is a really bad way of doing history. Just really have in your mind that what they want to do is go as far as back as the Big Bang in order to be able to explain any social or human phenomenon at all, or phenomena at all. But you really don't need to do that, and actually you shouldn't do that. It is a very, very bad way of doing history. As I once told you, I was actually proposed to join a big history team, but I would never do that. I respect history too much in order to do big history. So then our next topic, the durations of history. If you remember, we have basically three durations. The short history that are about is about all the very quick processes that we are able to observe in the life of one person, more or less. This is the thing, more than one life. This is usually called the history of the life of men. So yes, the history of the life of men. Why? Because the short duration really happens in very few times. So in the time that we have for living in our lifespan, we are able to observe these processes, but we really do not see the whole process. That is the point here. We may see some transformations, but we will never be able to see a whole process in the short duration. That is what actually is going to be setting apart the middle and the short duration. If you want to really be able to see a whole process, it is going to happen in the middle duration. This is where you're actually going to see a process. Why? Because remember that a process means to go from one state of things to another state of things. So you are in a state A, and then you have the process, and then you go to state B. So you change of state, like you have water in here, and after a process you are going to have vapor, right? Or you have ice in here, and then you're going to have liquid water. This is what means changing of state. It is as it may be as drastic as that, as going from ice to water or from water to vapor, right? So you're only going to be able to observe those whole processes when you observe the middle duration. Because in the middle duration, what we are going to have is the century, and the century is going to be our next topic for our exam. And finally, the long duration. The long duration, well, you may think about the long duration in two ways. Either it is something that lasts several centuries, so for example 3, 4, 5 centuries, or it is something that really relies on geological stuff. So these may be things or processes that you are not going to see in which you are not going to see any change at all unless the geological conditions change. For example, well, there is a very nice example that I gave you in class, in which the Roman Empire actually started with a lot of issues because all this region of Russia, of how do you call this region, really northeast of Russia, it is I don't remember, really close to Alaska. Give me a second, I will remember. No, I don't. Okay, it doesn't matter. All the north part of Russia, getting all the way into Alaska, there was a big climate change. So temperatures really came down. They really went down. So the land wasn't really fertile anymore. They weren't able to grow any crops anymore. So that was a big problem because all these peoples, well, as you call it peoples because you have a variety of societies, so they are peoples. All these peoples couldn't live in their territories anymore because they couldn't grow anything at all. So they started moving towards Europe, and that is going to be one of the main causes of the fall of the Roman Empire. So there are these very, very important things that are not going to change unless geological or geographical conditions change. That is why Fernand Braudel, that is the guy that is proposing this durations for us in history, he is going to be telling us that the longest duration is going to be the geological duration. The geological history is not talking about geology. Always remember that history is about human societies. And in here, believe me, Fernand Braudel wasn't as silly as David Christian, who is the developer of big history. Fernand Braudel was actually an intelligent person, not as David Christian, who really is not. But Fernand Braudel, when Fernand Braudel is talking about geological history, what he's saying is that there are some changes in human societies that we are not going to see unless the geological conditions change. As we were saying, in Mexico we eat corn, we eat beans, we eat chili, we eat pumpkins, and we're going to keep eating that unless the geological conditions change and unless we cannot grow those crops anymore. But as long as, or as far as we can still grow those crops, that is what we're going to be eating. So that would be the longest duration for history. These processes in human societies that will not happen unless geological conditions change. Processes that take as long as the changes in geology or in geography. Okay? So our next topic, as I was telling you, is the century. Remember that the century is a unit of analysis for history. So what is a unit of analysis? This is very important. A unit of analysis is the smallest thing that you can have, but that still is able to talk about what you're studying. So if you go smaller than your unit of analysis, you will be able to see some things, yes, but you are not going to be able to see what you are trying to find. For example, if you see a house and you go smaller than the bricks, well, you're still going to have some material, right? But you won't have any idea of what you are actually studying. So in this case, the century is the smallest thing about history that we can study that will still speak about the social processes. In here, when we see the short duration, we will be able to see some changes, yes, but no, not the whole process. We will be able to have a very nice unit of analysis, and a unit means a whole. Yes, one whole thing, one complete thing. We're only going to be able to see a complete process within the century. So that is why the century is the unit of analysis of history, because if I go smaller, I won't be able to see this complete process anymore. So what is the century? Remember that the century does not last 100 years for history. Not for history. When you are talking with your parents, when you are talking with your friends, when you are on the street talking with anybody, you may say that a century is 100 years. But when you are studying history as a science, we do not consider that the century has 100 years. All centuries are different. Remember that this idea is very important. Time means change. Time is always change. If you don't have change, then you don't have time. And if you don't have time, you are not doing science. Perhaps you are talking about religion, because religion is concerned with the study of eternity. But science is not. Science is concerned with the study of temporal things, of temporal matters. That is, science is concerned about studying things that change. If you don't have change, then you're not talking about science at all. And history has, of course, the same idea. So time is actually the matter in which history makes all its studies. And the basic unit of analysis, time unit of analysis for history is going to be the century. So time means change, and change in the idea that I was telling you just a few minutes ago. Change in terms of processes. But what are processes? Going from one state of things to another state of things. Remember, for example, going from liquid to gas to solid, yes, that is going from one state to another. So I always give you the example, and I always ask you to think about the 20th century. This is a map of the world in the 20th century. So you are basically have the world divided between several great empires: the Russian Empire, the British Empire, which are all the territories in yellow, the Chinese Empire, the United States, that during the 20th century is going to have Latin America as its empire. But all these are great empires, right? For example, France and all their colonies in Africa and all their colonies in Southeast Asia. The world was divided in in empires during the 20th century. But so basically in the 20th century, the first half of the century, what we are going to see is how these empires fall and how we won't have any empire at all left on Earth. By the first half of the 20th century, we don't have any more empires. So we may think of this process starting the 20th century with the First World War and all the way until the fall of the last empire. We may consider this process within the short duration. We're going to see the fall of something, but we are not going to see the complete process because we're not going to be seeing how it goes to another state when another state settles. We're only going to be able to see this whole process until we reach the century. So that is not going to be the short duration anymore. We're going to go to the middle duration, so that's the century. And in the century, we're not only going to see how these empires fell, but we're going to see how this new way of organization arose. And now we don't have just, we don't have empires anymore. And we also do not have let's say, broken empires. What we have now is capitalism, because the second half of the 20th century was basically the struggle and the fight between socialism and capitalism. So by the end of the 20th century, capitalism finally settles as the winner and as the only option of social or perhaps political and economic organization in the world. So the century will be this whole process. If you only see this is a short duration. If you only see how these empires fall in the first half of the 20th century, the only thing that you are seeing is a short duration. But the century, that is the middle duration, the unit of analysis of history, that is the whole process, is not only to see how these empires fell, but also to see how this new way of organization of the world arose and settled as the only possible way. So this will be the whole process, this will be the century, and of course the century is the middle duration. Middle duration usually doesn't go beyond 200 years. Once you have like 300 years, you're already talking about the long duration. But usually the middle duration is only 1 century, perhaps 2. But the century is the unit of analysis. And this is why, because only in the century you can see a whole process, a complete process. If you go smaller, like in the short duration, you may see some changes, but you won't be able to see the whole process. The whole process only happens within the century. Now, this is very important. All these 3 durations are a part of global or problem history, okay? Do not confuse yourselves, because perhaps in the short duration we are talking about the processes that we can see in the lifespan of one person, but that doesn't mean biography, okay? In biography, you're not explaining anything. You're just presenting the life of one person. In global history is the only type of history in which we try to explain something. So all these 3 durations are a part of global history. You can do global history in the short duration, in the middle duration, and in the long duration. Usually, global history is going to try to go to the long duration, to several centuries, because they will try, as it's trying to give you the global or the total explanation of one certain phenomenon, they're going to try to look it up in all the centuries in which it is happening. So, for example, the Royal Touch, he's presenting and studying more or less 5 or 6 centuries. So this is really long duration, right? But do not get confused. These durations are all a part of global history. Global history was proposed by Marc Bloch, and Lucien Febvre is actually one follower of Marc Bloch. When Marc Bloch died, then Fernand Braudel continued with the magazine that Bloch and Lucien Febvre started together. And finally, sources for history. Remember, we have primary sources that are sources that come from the same time of the phenomenon that I am studying, and secondary sources, as opposed to that, are sources that were written or were produced after the phenomenon that I am studying. So, for example, if I am studying something from the 16th century, then a primary source is something that comes from the 16th century, and the secondary source would be something from the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, any century at all after the 16th century that is talking about the problem that I am trying to research, but it is no longer a source coming from the same date. Primary sources always come from the same date than the phenomenon that I am trying to explain. And after that, both in primary and in secondary, we have direct and indirect sources. Most indirect sources will actually be primary sources, but you can also have the chance in which they are direct sources. So, in which direct sources may be, indirect sources may be secondary sources, but usually indirect sources will be primary sources. However, do not forget about this possibility. Let me just highlight it. This possibility, no, sorry, not this one. This possibility isn't so usual, but it may happen. Secondary indirect sources are usually primary sources, but you may be able to find a secondary source that is also indirect. So what is the difference between direct and indirect sources? Well, indirect sources, the one that is writing or producing this source is intending to do that, to leave a testimony behind for history. The author of this source wants to leave a testimony for history, and in indirect history, they are not. They just leave some testimony behind, but they don't even realize they are doing that. They are not leaving this testimony behind for historians to use it. They are just producing something, and this something is going to to stay there for history. Now, this is very important, boys and girls. The favorite sources for history are primary indirect sources. Why? Well, because when you have a direct source, so that is a source in which someone wanted to leave a testimony behind, this version of things, this point of view of things may be altered. The author of this direct source may be lying, maybe trying to cheat you, maybe trying to trick you into believing something, and that something may be wrong, may not be the right way of seeing things. So in indirect sources, perhaps they are lying, but at least they are not lying to you. Direct sources, when direct sources are lying, they are lying to the historian, and that is what they are trying to do, to lie to the historian, to tell the historian another side of things. And in indirect sources, perhaps they are lying, but at least they are not lying to the historian, because they are not thinking about the historian when they are producing this source. So of course primary, because they come from the time that we are studying, and indirect because of that reason, and because the second reason is that if we only use direct sources, then we're only going to be repeating what other people already said. Like Mark Bloch is using this example of Tito Livio. Tito Livio wrote 142 books about the history of Rome, and he was a Roman, so it is more or less a primary source. And it is a direct source because he's intending to write these books for history. However, if I only use the books coming from Tito Livio in order to write a history about Rome, well, then I will only be repeating what Tito Livio already said. But if I use indirect sources, then I am able to answer other questions that perhaps Tito Livio is not treating. And I may give some let's say, original answers to these problems. So those are the main problems with direct sources, that they may be lying, and also if I only use direct sources, then I would only be repeating what someone already said. So those are basically the topics that you have to know for your exam. Please study them, be sure that your notes are complete, and good luck.